Hello students, welcome to lesson 5 on species interactions, ecological succession, and population control. Today we'll cover about 15 slides in this presentation, and we're going to learn about things like ecological interactions. So one example that you're going to look at is how species interact. So this is a topic that often is introduced in even as early as elementary school. We start to talk about predators and prey within an ecosystem. A bell ringer your teacher may have you complete is listing 3 predator and 3 prey. So please take a moment to do that and pause to complete that. Alright, now that you have a couple examples to share with your teacher, we're going to move on to the next slide. So in this unit, in the first part of this unit, we're going to start to talk about how species actually interact. So throughout this entire presentation, you're going to learn about how to explain species competition for resources, how to recognize feeding relationships between different types of species, how to understand interactions between predator, prey, and some of those factors that drive evolution. And you're also going to differentiate between parasitism, mutualism, and commensalism. So here are some of the key terms that we're going to cover throughout this unit. This is a good place to reference as you start to prepare for your exam. Throughout this unit, we're going to cover each of these terms, so this is a good slide to kind of go back to and practice some of these key terms. So there are different types of competition within an ecosystem. So species basically, they're going to compete for limited resources. So limited resources can include things like water, light, space. So when the competition is in a single species, so competing for resources with other organisms that are the same species of you, that is called intra-specific competition. The prefix intra means within. So intra-specific competition means competition within your species. So when the species are competing with resources between other species or different species, it is called inter-specific competition. So inter, that prefix, means between. So meaning between other species. So most of the time, the interspecific competition is going to involve at least one species that's getting better at obtaining the resources than the other species. So in a competition, there's usually a winner, and that happens in nature as well. So when 2 or more different species are interacting to compete, this is typically due to their niches or their roles within the ecosystem. That's what that word niches mean. Start to overlap, and when that happens, they compete for resources. So a little bit more on competition. So if one species takes over a large portion of a resource, this is going to force the other species to actually either move out of that area or adapt, or they could even suffer a population decline, and sometimes they could even go extinct. So humans are part of that. Like, we compete for resources with the organisms. For example, a farmer will plant their crops, and they're in competition with all the animals that are trying to eat those crops. Right? So the farmer wants to protect the crops so they can harvest the crops, and the animals just want to eat them so they can survive. So as humans, we compete with other organisms for things like space, food, and other resources as well. We're not exempt from this. So as our ecological footprint grows and we spread it out and we start to take over and degrade habitats, many of those other species can suffer as a result. So resources are a big deal. Organisms need these resources in order to be able to survive. So organisms need water, they need food, they need space, they need their habitat in which they live. So if given enough time, natural selection can occur or will occur on organisms. So that basically means populations can actually start to develop adaptations that enable them to reduce or avoid competition with the species. So by adaptations, we're talking about specific characteristics that allow them to survive and reproduce in their current environment. So resource partitioning is when you have species competing for scarce resources, and then they actually specialize in certain traits that allow them to use the same resource. So that basically means that the species will use different portions of the resource at different times or in a different way. So an example would be different bird adaptations that allow them to use different parts of a tree to reduce competition by feeding on different insects. So maybe they're feeding on different insects, or maybe one type of bird is feeding on the upper portions of the tree and another type are feeding on the lower portions. So species also prey on other species, obviously, and that is going to introduce and continue to make the environment more hostile. So you have limited resources, but you also have predation that occurs. So predation is when a member of one species is a predator or the hunter, and it feeds directly on all or another portion of organisms within the food web. So those things that the predator are eating, they are called prey, and they are the species that is being hunted. And the relationship between the two is called a predator-prey relationship. So that predator-prey both have a direct effect on how the populations will thrive in the ecosystem. So, for example, if a gazelle runs out of grass to graze on and they start dying off, then the cheetah numbers will start to drop if they don't have enough gazelle to eat and sustain their population. So the cheetah will start to decline due to their being not enough food, but if the gazelle numbers start to increase, so will the cheetah population because they'll have more food. So examples of predators, you can see some, of course, a lion would represent a predator. They have a variety of methods to help them capture prey. So cheetahs can basically, they have an adaptation that they're super fast. They have these long legs and they can run really fast, and they're agile. They have great camouflage. So they get their prey by chasing it down. Bald eagles can fly, and they have really good eyesight, so they can spot prey from far above and then attack them, or even steal the prey from another organism. Other animals hunt in packs, such as gray wolves, so they kind of work together to surround or corner organisms or the prey. Praying mantises basically use camouflage to match flowers and plants. So all these different organisms, even spiders, they build webs to capture their prey. So there are a lot of different types of predators. Oftentimes students have this misconception that they're just these big animals like the lions and cheetahs, but even praying mantis, and what we recognize as insects, will be able to also be considered a predator if they are consuming these other animals. So prey are the organisms that the predators are eating, but they have also evolved in many ways to protect themselves from predators. So some of them are highly sensitive in hearing, sight, smell, and also really good eyes to help them. I already said that, but they have a really good ability to sense something that is approaching. So any hunter knows that they need to make sure that their clothing is nice and clean. A lot of hunters air their clothing out so they can, so the scent is the same as the outdoors prior to their hunting trips. That's so the prey species that they may be hunting are not going to detect their odor. So other prey use camouflage, so they can match bird droppings on leaves or even mimic other predator species with their coloration. So other prey have developed even chemical protection. So you have these bombardier beetles, skunks, stink bugs, squid, octopus, and even monarch butterflies all have chemical protection. So if you've ever smelt a skunk up close or have ever been sprayed by a skunk, you know that it would not be a pleasant experience. So that is a situation you would want to avoid in the future, and that allows those organisms to survive better. There are also a multitude of other ways that prey have developed to avoid being protected or consumed rather by the predators. So as we start to kind of dive into this predator-prey interactions, when we look at predator-prey interactions, we actually see that this is a strong driver in evolution and causing these organisms to have to develop these adaptations to be able to survive against their predators. So in contrast to, so basically predation only benefits the predator. So this is what we would say is a plus-minus relationship, meaning the predator benefits, the minus is the prey, and they obviously don't benefit because they die. So in predator-prey relationships, predation harms the species that become the prey. So in this case, so predators basically tend to remove the weaker portions of the population of the member species because they're just easier to either see, easier to catch, or maybe they're smaller and aren't fighting back as well. So nonetheless, they are weaker and they are easier to get. So that makes it an easier meal for the predator, and the predator really doesn't want to work any harder than it has to because it uses energy to do work. So coevolution is basically what happens when you have two species that evolve together. All right, so it's a mode of natural selection where changes in the gene pool of one species leads to changes in another species. So, for example, bats emit a high-frequency echo to locate their prey called echolocation. So over time, certain species of moth have evolved to drop to the ground or fly in weird patterns if they detect those frequencies. So as the bats have this really cool echolocation, the moths eventually developed this evasive tactic that allowed them to survive when they detect that echolocation. So that's a pretty cool example of coevolution, but there are many others out there. Parasitism is when you have one organism known as a parasite, and that lives in another organism, the host. And that interaction's only going to benefit the parasite, and that's going to come at the expense of the host. So parasites basically, this would be, again, a plus-minus relationship. The difference between this plus-minus relationship and the plus-minus relationship for the predator-prey relationship is, if you recall in the predator-prey, the plus was for the predator because it got food, and the minus was for the prey, but it was minus because the prey died. Parasites are, they're getting a plus because they're getting a meal, and the host here is going to be harmed, but not usually killed. Now, that can happen, but it's usually a result of some sort of disease that results from the parasite living inside of the organism. So some examples, tapeworms, lampreys, mistletoe, fleas, ticks, protozoa, tuberculosis. So those are all examples of parasitism. So some species actually form really close relationships and work together. So the previous examples we looked at, they're all involved some negative aspect. But for mutualism, this is when both species actually behave in a way that benefits both species. So whether it be by giving food, shelter, or some other resources. So for example, bees pollinate flowers. The flowers get the pollen spread from plant to plant. For cross-pollination, which is good for genetic diversity. And the bee gets food. So there's also bacteria that live in your guts. And animals eat, so we eat and digest food. And the animal, we get the ability to break down some of the foods, so it makes more energy available to us. And the bacteria also are able to get some energy from that as well. So we'd call those, if they're in our gut and they're not causing problems, they would call those probiotics. And our last slide of content here is talking about commensalism. So this is an area within an ecosystem where you have one organism that benefits, one is unaffected. So when one species benefits but the other receives no harm or benefit from the interaction, we call that commensalism. So this is a tricky word for my students to read oftentimes, so it wouldn't hurt to say that one a couple times. If you can say a word, it's much easier to remember what that word actually is. So it's a good practice to practice saying these words. So commensalism is the word. So an example of a commensalism relationship would be epiphytes, which are basically air plants that attach themselves to the trunk of trees and tropical forests. They benefit because they have a solid base to grow in an elevated location, so way off the ground. That gives them better chance to get some water and sunlight, and they get nothing really from the trees they're attached to other than help. And they also don't harm the trees. Typically you'll get birds that will nest in trees as well, so that's another example. The birds get shelter, but they don't harm the tree or really give it any real benefit. So those are examples of commensalism relationships, where one organism benefits, the other is unaffected. Your teacher may expect that you answer some of these questions, so as the day closes out, please be prepared to provide your teacher with some of these answers. So feel free to scroll back through the video to help you answer some of these questions. And that concludes the end of day 1 notes. I hope you found that helpful.